Hi, I'm Marianne Munro. I'm the Director of Regulation Reform and Practice in the Victorian Department of Health and Human Services, and I'm also a member of the Steering Committee for the National Regulators Community of Practice. I'm really pleased to be facilitating today's session because if there was ever a time when health regulators across the country and around the world are focused on community trust and their social licence, that time is now. It is my great pleasure now to introduce you to our speakers today. Edward Langley has over 20 years media and social research experience. In 2015, he moved from the UK to join the social research team at Colmar Brunton in New Zealand. Since then, he has undertaken many reputation studies for public sector clients, both in the UK and in New Zealand. In 2020, he led Colmar Brunton's Public Sector Reputation Index, the results of which he'll be presenting today. James Shipton commenced as ASIC chair on the 1st of February 2018, bringing more than 20 years experience in regulation, financial markets, the law and academia, both internationally and in Australia. Most recently, he was the Executive Director of Harvard Law School's Program on International Financial Systems. And prior to that, his career has included Executive Director and Commission Member of the Securities and Futures Commission of Hong Kong and almost a decade at Goldman Sachs in Hong Kong. Welcome, Edward and James. It's really great to have you both here today. So while Edward is preparing to put his slides up, we're going to throw to a couple of Slido polls to check how today's participants feel about trust and social licence. That's great. I think we'll stop that one there. Thank you for that. Some really mixed results there in that last survey. I'm glad to see in the first one that there was a general feeling of a moderate level of trust. I was pleased to see there was no one felt deeply distrusted. That'd be a bit of a worry. But look, real mixed bag in that last poll, and I think it's a great segue into Edward's presentation. So I will hand over to Edward, who's going to tell us the fascinating story about what matters for public sector regulation and also how that's been changed with COVID-19.
I'm going to take you through the Public Sector Reputation Index. So Colmar Brunton has been doing the index since 2016, and really came out of a desire from public sector agencies wanting to understand how does their reputation compare to their peers and give that kind of sort of relative positioning. So in 2020, we surveyed almost 3,000 New Zealanders, and we did that, as it so happened, in the run-up to lockdown. So lockdown here in New Zealand started on the 25th of March, and the survey ran from the 10th to the 25th of March as the COVID situation obviously worsened in that run-up. We measured over 50 public sector agencies on the index and shared their headline scores with all of those agencies. So the Reputation Index uses a global framework that we took from our parent company, but we then adapted that for the New Zealand context and also for the public sector as well. So reputation is measured across 4 pillars. These 4 pillars are the building blocks, if you like, of reputation. So that's trust, social responsibility, leadership and fairness. The public rate each of the agencies across a number of different attributes under those pillars. So, for example, with trust, you can see that you've got listening to the public's point of view, using taxpayers' money responsibly, being trustworthy, or being relied upon to protect individuals' personal information. Those ratings for the attributes combine into the ratings for the pillars, and then they combine to create the overall reputation score. Because it's an index, the average reputation is 100. So if you're above 105, you've got a relatively strong, good reputation. If you're below 95, it's considered to be relatively weak. So what are some of the reputational trends that we were seeing in 2020? Well, here again, we've got the 4 pillars, and what we've done here is shown the relative weighting that each pillar has in terms of reputation, the overall reputation. So we do a bit of statistical analysis to work this out to understand what is driving reputation. So we can see that trust, which historically has been the most important pillar, continues to be important. 29% of reputation is accounted for, if you like, by those trust scores. But social responsibility has increased in terms of importance, whereas fairness has decreased. So if we look under social responsibility, we can see that there we have attributes relating to environmental responsibility, but also having a positive influence on society and indeed well-being. And if we think about 2019, then obviously we had the environmental issues come to the fore. It all seems a very long time ago now. But the climate strikes, and also in New Zealand we had the well-being budget as well here in 2019, which was a kind of global first. It's interesting with the fairness pillar as to whether that will actually become more important in 2021 when we revisit this following the Black Lives Matter, and if we're going into a period of potential rebellion as well. As I mentioned earlier, we did the research in the run-up to lockdown, so that provided us an opportunity to look at actually how was people's views and what was important to them in terms of reputation changing over that period. So we can see that pre-alert level 3, and alert level 3 is where things got really serious. Before alert level 3, social responsibility was actually starting to come through as the most important pillar, overtaking trust. But when we moved into alert level 3, then actually trust again became the more dominant pillar. And I guess at a time of crisis, we're looking to put our faith and confidence in the public sector and in the government as well. So trust became ever more important as the run-up to COVID. But how do New Zealanders rate our public sector agencies when it comes to trust? So what I have here are the different attributes that contribute to trust. So you can see those who agree with the different attributes and those who disagree. And this is the average across all of the 54 agencies in the public sector. And you can see that over time, we have seen a trend where trust is lifting, and indeed those who disagree where that's going down. So that was quite interesting to note over the last few years. But that trend seems to have been accelerated as we headed into the COVID crisis in 2020. So certainly it was a pre-existing trend, but one that has been accelerated. It's also something that we see with the other pillars that make up trust. So again, improving perceptions of the public sector. And that trend was kind of gradual and steady between 2017 and 2019, but it seems to have been accelerated under 2020. So where does this place our public agencies? So what we've done here is shown the top 10, and we do publish the top 10, so I can share those with you. And you can see the Fire and Emergency Service are out there on top. So they have a score of 120. So just a reminder that a score of 100 is the average, and a score of 105 plus represents a relatively strong reputation, good reputation. So Fire and Emergency lead the way, followed by the Defence Force and Customs Service. So when you look at that top 10, there's a few words that spring to mind. Uniform might be one of them. So that's always a tactic to take. But also protection as well is something that perhaps cuts through. So these agencies are involved in not only protecting, if you like, our property and our borders, but also protecting our environment as well. The final word that kind of sprang to mind for me when looking at this was science. And that's represented by some of our leading science agencies there, so Calhan Innovation, Met Service, NIWA, and indeed DOC as well. So we've spoken about some of the building blocks in terms of reputation, but also customer experience is an important aspect for those agencies that are grounded in experience. And in 2019, we looked at experience and we found that it can have a significant impact in terms of the proportion of advocates or critics that any one agency might have. So those good experiences tend to stick in people's memories, But the bad experiences, well, they stick around even longer. They perhaps stick around for up to 10 years, we found. So how do New Zealand public sector, how do they fare when it comes to experience? So we've shown here that over half of our agencies, 56%, are delivering positive experiences for the majority of people who interact with them. However, that does still mean that there's a considerable proportion who could be delivering stronger experiences. And we feel this will be particularly important, of course, in the era of COVID-19, when people will be engaging with the public sector in new ways that they hadn't done before. One of the areas that we wanted to explore in 2020 was the extent to which an agency's purpose impacted their reputation or not. So we asked the question to the extent to which you feel that an agency's work is important for New Zealand. And by and large, people felt that the different agencies were doing important work. 67% is the average level of agreement. We're broadly on board with what the public sector are doing, or at least their purpose. So what we then did is we've looked to plot that legitimacy of purpose by reputation. So if we look at the horizontal axis, you can see that the agreement levels for those who feel that the work done by that agency is important. So that goes from 40% up to 90% of the fire and emergency service have very high legitimacy of purpose. Then on the vertical axis, we've got the RepC score, the reputation score, and that goes from, you can see that the higher up they are, the better the reputation. And you can see the line of best fit indicates that as legitimacy of purpose builds, so then does an agency's reputation. So it's important about how you feel about the purpose of an agency. We also looked at the extent to which what you know and understand about an agency impacts how you feel about them. So the horizontal axis this time, the further to the right, the stronger the understanding. And again, we've got the reputation score on the vertical axis, so the higher up you are, the stronger your reputation. So actually, you can see by the flat line there that we have, that the more you understand about the reputation, or sorry, the more you understand about an organisation doesn't necessarily tie in with your perceptions of them in terms of your reputation. So in essence, what these slides are telling us, it's really about how you feel about an organisation's purpose rather than what you know about an organisation. So finally, I just wanted to kind of bring things up to date, if you like, in terms of how COVID has then gone on to impact reputation, certainly at least of the government in New Zealand. So we asked a question back in February 2020, which was for the Victoria University of Wellington. And that was one that we've asked a number of times, which was how much do you trust, or how much trust do you have in the government to deal successfully with national problems? So around 3 out of 5 say agree that they do, have a great or reasonable amount of trust in the government. And that had been fairly static for a number of years. However, in the height of the lockdown, that rose to 86%, so a pretty remarkable difference there. And even after we had come out of the lockdown and we were in level 1, 77% still said that they had trust, and that was after a few border bungles as well. So it shows that certainly, at least in the sort of short to medium term impact, the way that the government has handled things and the public sector has responded to the COVID crisis here in New Zealand has helped engender trust. Part of the way that that trust is being built is through strong communications. So we asked again the public how they would rate New Zealand's government on how it's communicated information about the coronavirus outbreak. 91% rate that as fairly good or very good. Now that compares to a G7 average of 51%. And you can see that Canada, after New Zealand, was the leading nation, and that went down to Japan there at the bottom. We didn't have America wasn't actually or it wasn't asked of the American respondents, which would have been a fascinating insight into how Mr. Trump's been communicating. And obviously, when we asked people what they liked about the communications, well, I'm sure, as you're all aware, you know, we've enjoyed Jacinda Mania here in New Zealand, and indeed she's become somewhat of a global superstar in terms of kind of communications. And certainly people seem to appreciate and value the style and the way that information was communicated at those daily briefings. But not only Jacinda, actually, there was another kind of rising star that came to the fore in this, which was Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, our Director General of Health. And he is somewhat venerated now. You can see T-shirts of him saint-like in Wellington. But again, it shows that how strong their kind of communications were, that people appreciated the fact that they were being human, and that they kind of, you know, where they look to try to cut through the bullshit. Just looking now as well at what some of the impact has been then of that handling of the crisis. So again, some questions that we asked in June in level 1, and we found that on balance, New Zealanders say that they're now more likely to trust the government than they were before and follow government advice, but also that they're more open to messaging. So whether that's messaging around healthy lifestyles or maybe messaging around safety, they're more open than they were before. Interestingly, though, they're also a bit more critical in the sense that they would be more questioning, or say they'd be more questioning, of media stories. I don't know if that's about exposure to the daily press conferences and seeing close at hand how some of our media operate, but I'll leave you to speculate on that. So finally, I'd just like to wrap up with what are our 3 key takeouts from the 2020 index. So, as I've explained, there's certainly been improved perceptions of the public sector, and that's happened for a number of years, but really accelerated under COVID-19. And that set the ground, if you like, for the government to be able to provide a strong response, which has further kind of solidified that position and engendered greater trust in the government and public sector. The second key takeout is that it's not really what you know so much as how you feel about an agency, and that its legitimacy of purpose is essential in helping to establish that reputation. So it's important to show that, if you like, what your motivation is, and that you're that you're on the public side. Then finally, we look at delivering the importance of delivering strong experiences. So we know that experience due to COVID, people will be having a whole raft of new experiences in engaging with the public sector. So that's whether as a small business looking for financial assistance or advice, or whether that might be actually in terms of navigating your way around the welfare system. There's a whole raft of new experiences, and those new experiences will be important in shaping reputation for years to come and throughout the next decade. So it's critical that our public agencies get it right. And on that note, I shall leave you.
Thanks, Edward, for a fantastic presentation. Lots of questions coming out of that for me, and there's certainly some coming through on the Slido. Keep them coming through, but I will now move on to ask James Shipton to give us some brief reflections on trust post-Royal Commission and also in the COVID-19 environment. Thanks, James.
Well, thanks, Marianne, and thanks for having me today, and hello to everybody. I actually wanted to pick up on some of the really excellent and insightful points that Edward's raised and pick up 3 things if I could. I want to start by talking about what is trust and why it's so important, particularly the concept, and Edward mentioned this, of trustworthiness. I then want to apply those concepts to the financial system, that's the system that we at ASIC regulate, and explore how that intersects with the important concept of social license. And in doing so, I will also explore the role of a regulator in catalyzing trust in the system itself and the participants that it regulates. And finally, I want to touch on the importance of a regulator in developing trust itself in order to do its job effectively. And of course, I'm looking forward to taking your questions. So turning to the first point, what is trust? And according to some very useful work by the CFA Institute, trust requires one to be worthy of trust. In other words, one must be trustworthy. The CFA identified 3 factors that assist in this. The first one is competence. That is having the right skills and knowledge to do the job. Second is care. That is attention and consideration applied to doing something correctly and avoiding risk, harm, or damage for the recipient. Or, as Edward was saying, being on the side of the public. Third, ethics. That's doing the right thing, even when no one else is watching. And overlaying all of this is that trust has to be earned. It cannot automatically appear or be legislated for overnight. And reflecting all of this is an observation that we as human beings are more likely to go to a close friend or a family member for advice and guidance. We do this because we know that they care for us. They are looking out for us. They have our best interests at heart. This is where, for me, the concept of professionalism comes in. Professionalism is a cultural concept that we have been advocating for quite some time at ASIC. And professionalism is constituted by competence and conscientiousness. So referring back to Edward's presentation, where we saw that the New Zealand firefighters and emergency services have the highest trust levels in government, I would observe that this is probably because they are perceived and are competent. They train and exercise all the time. They've earned that trust through brave, selfless, and courageous acts. They care. They put themselves into harm's way to protect us. And they are professional in everything they do. They are competent and conscientious. So I think that more broadly, a professional culture and mindset can help remedying any trust deficit that we are seeing and ensuring better adherence to the law and society's expectations. And this is something that manifests itself in a social license to operate. Now, turning to why trust is so important. Trust is crucial to the efficient functioning of every part of society. We put our trust in the broader societal system every day. We trust the bus driver, we trust the train driver. We trust other drivers on the road. We trust the grocery store and the supply chains behind it. We trust the banks, and I could go on. Trust is everywhere. Or should I say, trust is needed everywhere. Economists talk in terms of confidence, and that really is the need for economic resilience and growth. We must have confidence. But put another way, confidence is having faith or trust in something. So the economic system itself, in large part, relies on trust and confidence. And this is something we can see in stark relief right now as societal confidence is under strain. We at ASIC regulate the financial system and corporations. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to concentrate my observations here on the financial system because it impacts every single Australian and every single New Zealander. I firmly believe that the financial system exists to serve the community and to serve people. Because the financial system is ultimately dealing with other people's money. And by that, I mean our money. The financial system relies on trust. We trust banks to keep our savings safe. We trust superannuation funds to support our retirement. Everywhere within the financial system, trust is needed and relied upon. In fact, the origin of the word credit is the Latin word for trust, credere. Every single cent in the financial system is other people's money. Too often we just think of the financial system as an amalgam of companies, pension funds, insurance companies, mutual funds, sovereign wealth funds, and so on. But yet, at the end of each of these corporate structures, at the end of every shareholding chain, are people. Pension funds and superannuation funds exist for retirees. Mutual funds exist for individual investors, and even sovereign wealth funds exist for citizens. All these platforms exist for people. As I've said before, the financial industry deals with other people's money. Accordingly, it is profoundly important that people have trust in that system, more so now than ever before. The idea that corporations act in the service of people also gives rise to concepts like the social license to operate. In many ways, the motivation for calling the Financial Services Royal Commission in Australia was because poor conduct by many financial institutions was fraying the trust the community had in the financial sector and putting at risk that social license. That's why the Royal Commission looked at not just breaches of the law, but also community expectations. So what is the role of a corporate or financial regulator in all of this? Ultimately, ASIC's mission and purpose is to work towards a fair, strong, and efficient financial system for all Australians. As we know, Australia faces significant challenges as the result of the pandemic. ASIC is committed to making a real difference in the way our economy and our community navigates this difficult time. We have actually responded rapidly and strategically to the challenges created by the pandemic by focusing on protecting vulnerable consumers, maintaining the integrity of markets, and supporting businesses. And all of this we are doing ultimately with the aim of ensuring confidence and trust in the system itself, so that the system can support Australians in time of economic strain. So the challenge for us in the public service, working for public institutions, is both firstly to catalyse trust in the systems we regulate or influence, and secondly, and at the same time, build up trust in our own institutions and agencies, and that is build institutional credibility. Unfortunately, we're starting at a less than ideal position. According to the latest Edelman Trust Barometer, trust in Australian governmental institutions is only at 41%. And that seems to be broadly in line with what Edward was saying about 50% in New Zealand. Compared to business, which is 50% in the Edelman Trust Barometer in Australia. This is to compare with an 80% trust level in the scientific community. And again, Edward had very similar numbers for New Zealand. And so I think the New Zealand Fire and Emergency Services provides a great example. Their ability to respond effectively and efficiently is because of the trust that the community places in them. Now, I know this isn't a like-for-like example, but there isn't a cohort of critics who stand by the side of the road telling the firemen and women how to do their jobs or criticise them as they do it. We just trust them to get on and fight the fire. In summary, we can't legislate for trust, but we can work towards some of its component parts, which are being competent and conscientious, that is being professional, acting with confidence, conscientiousness, and importantly, care. That leads to being caring. by embracing and embedding concepts of care and fairness, and Edward raised purpose. We at ASIC are advocating fairness in the financial system because we think that this helps demonstrate and catalyze genuine human care and concern. And above all, we all have to earn that trust, just as the brave firefighters and medical workers have so clearly shown. I'm going to close and hand back to Marianne, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, James, for those fantastic insights. Before I do throw to the crowd, I have a couple of questions of my own that I'm going to take the liberty of asking you. Many people on the line today will be familiar with Professor Malcolm Sparrow's famous dictum, which is find important problems, fix them, then tell everyone. If you applied that to ASIC's situation after the Royal Commission, which problems turned out to be the most important ones, and how important was the tell everyone element of the equation?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I'm a huge fan of Malcolm Sparrow's, and I've learned a lot over the years from him, and he's absolutely right. Part of our mission to earn that trust and to develop trustworthiness is to get the message out. And that is just so fundamentally important. And I was very much taken and agree with what Edward was saying about the purpose. And it's not just our actual purpose, but it's the purpose that is perceived and understood by the community at large. And we learnt that we need to get our purpose and our message out to the broader community, because understanding, the community understanding what we do and how we do it is absolutely fundamentally vitally important for not just developing trust and institutional credibility, but the efficiency of what we do. Now, I actually do think that there's actually, believe it or not, a broader role for popular culture in this. And again, using the example of doctors and nurses, of firemen and women, there's lots of popular shows out there that show and demonstrate their bravery. And that reinforces the point. An interesting anecdote that I had was when I was working at the Hong Kong financial regulator, there was actually a television show about our work. And we actually found out that the understanding of our purpose, the understanding of our role, the understanding of our mission was better understood because we're using broader popular channels like a television show. But it's absolutely fundamental for that purpose, for that understanding, and for the community to actually understand that we care and actually have their backs. And that's something that came through in Edward's remarks.
Thanks, James. I might just pick up on your point about the Hong Kong example there. You've obviously had the opportunity to work in many different countries and cultures. How differently do you think the trust and reputation question plays out in Australia and New Zealand, say, compared to the US or in Asia?
What I'd like to do, without naming any countries, is just make an observation, having worked closely in a number of different countries, about the fundamental importance of institutional credibility. And I think in Australia and New Zealand, we take it for granted because we have, at the end of the day, great institutions. I've actually seen institutions decline and public trust in them plummet. And that is actually heartbreaking for the system itself. And so what I wanted to do in answer to that is just reinforce that all of us who work for these great institutions and agencies, we actually have such a vitally important role to perform. We are actually, in part, the pillars and the foundation of the very system itself. And we have to understand that, because unfortunately I've seen that corrode in other places, and it's heartbreaking when it does.
Yes, and of course, regulators don't operate in a vacuum, do they? In relation to the industries they regulate. In your experience, do regulators sometimes suffer from collateral reputational damage when duty holders behave badly? Yeah. This, of course, isn't just about the financial regulators. You could say the same thing potentially about aged care at the moment. So how can a regulator help the community to kind of decipher between the regulator and regulated entities?
Yeah, so this is a great question because it is related to what Professor Sparrow said, tell everybody. But part of telling everybody is explaining the limitations of what we can and cannot do. And that's where an expectations gap comes up. Because if that is not well understood and the purpose and the limitations are not well understood, then there is a huge risk of what I call conflation, where the bad actors are conflated with those who are trying to prevent that, but they are perceived to be part of the problem. And there was no shortage during the Financial Services Royal Commission in Australia where there was conflation of the bad actors of the sector being essentially in large part, in some cases, blamed on the regulatory structure and the regulators. The lesson there is that we have to get the message out of what we can and cannot do. And if necessary, we have to get the message out that maybe there is a thin blue line, because we can't be all things to all people all the time. And I do actually think the security agencies, law enforcement agencies over the decades have done a really good job. We no longer blame the police if there is a crime, but what we do look for is the police to react to that crime. And that's something that I think all of us and other agencies need to realise. It is in part a management of the expectations gap and an explanation, a mature discussion about what we can and cannot do.
Great, thank you, James. I will now turn to the Slido questions. There's quite a lot there, but do keep them coming in and keep liking the ones that you'd like to see answered. I might throw to Edward for the first one, but perhaps come back to you as well, James. There's quite a few questions around this notion of having that conversation with the community. So one of the questions is, what does a regulator need to build social license where the community does not fully understand the regulated activity? And I might throw another one in the mix there as well as an example. Somebody's asked, as a science-based regulator, is it worth trying to build trust with those who don't fundamentally accept the science? So I think they both go to that question about how do you, manage those expectations with community.
Yeah, that second one's is certainly a challenging one, isn't it, in terms of trying to persuade people of the science. I mean, certainly I've been involved in kind of deliberative forums in the past where we've looked at things like climate change, geoengineering, and and when you do have people kind of come together in those forums and spend time with one another and almost step outside of their circles, which sometimes is obviously what we often lack currently, it does feel that you can have conversations where people do start listening to one another and can kind of get past some of their preconceptions. So those kind of sort of deliberative forums, I've seen that take place. How you can replicate that in the real world, I'm certainly a challenge. I'm not so sure of that.
James, did you have a view on that one?
Yeah, I do. It's a great question, and let me try and answer it from our perspective, because I think what comes out of that question is two things. Firstly, you have to recognise what are the touch points of the area that you're regulating with the community, and recognise those touch points, and recognise just how people and what you regulate or the sector that you're involved in intersects with real people. And that's why we're spending a lot of time emphasising that financial system is actually about people. It's only about people at the end of the day. Then the other, so you have to understand that, and that's complex and far more complex than perhaps may first meets the eye, because there's a lot of misunderstanding, and this leads to my second point, particularly in complex areas, there is actually limited engagement sometimes by the community. And we sort of see that in Australia when it comes to superannuation, saving and retirement. The engagement levels are low. And part of what we are trying to do, and other agencies trying to do this, is actually increase the level of engagement and understanding by people in these, and they are complex areas. And what we've been doing, and I know that the New Zealand Financial Capability Commission does the same through our Money Smart website, is try and increase an understanding and an awareness of the financial system. That's a real community engagement piece and part of what we do. That's almost foundational. And unless we have that foundational engagement, that foundational understanding, it is, yes, it's very hard. So that's why we're trying to take a step back. And I know the FMA in New Zealand, and I know the Financial Capability Commission in New Zealand are doing the same, is build that foundation and that broader understanding. And actually, that's why it goes often beyond just our agency itself. We work very closely with schools. We work very closely with other government agencies. We work very closely with state and federal authorities. We have to have a real alliance to build that level of engagement, particularly with very complex concepts, which the financial system is, and science is as well. That's probably the best I can do to answer that really important and challenging question.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear, James, actually, because, you know, sometimes if you think about regulators, they're sometimes, you know, offering a service, if you like, that no one wants. The regulated parties don't necessarily welcome it, and often, you know, the community doesn't engage until something goes wrong. So that's a really positive message there. It's quite related to another question, so I'll go to this one and throw it to you, James. The question is a clear educative or a strong enforcement stance more influential in the perception of regulatory effectiveness? So how do you balance that community engagement with the strong enforcement?
Both, and plus more, because to again channel Malcolm Sparrow, the art of regulation, or the craft of regulation, as he says, is to use different tools at different times for different purposes and different problems. And we then need to get the message out, and that is in part communicating the deterrence message, which is really important, communicating the engagement message that I've just spoken about with the broader community, but also the engagement with the sector itself. That's a really important tool. To be brutally honest, today is a really important tool. We get our message out, you know, hopefully it'll live on YouTube for a while, and we get that message out and that engagement out. And so I sort of see that our communications challenge and our engagement challenge is directly referable to all of our different tools. And we have to use communication, regulatory communication and other communication as a tool to address a particular problem, as well as to build trust and confidence by the community in us, but also a better understanding of where we're coming from with our regulated population. Because I'm still convinced, having spent most of my career, but not all of my career in the private sector, that there is a fundamental misunderstanding or miscommunication between the regulators and the regulated. I use the expression that we're talking past each other. And you mentioned, Marianne, just before about the role of regulation. And, you know, we're in the business of delivering obligations. We're in the business of molding norms to meet the law and societal expectations. That's the business that we're in. And we use different tools at different times to modify those behaviors so that the underlying enterprise, for us, finance and corporations, is better for it. And that's often, that basic line, that basic purpose is not just misunderstood by the broader community, it's often misunderstood by the regulated population. So that's why what Edward was saying about purpose and the perception of that purpose resonated so much with me, because it's not just about the community, it's also about the regulated entities and population themselves.
Thanks, James. I agree. I think that's one of the really fascinating findings in Edward's work about the perception of the purpose is way more important than how much the person knows about the agency and the work they do. I might throw back to Edward again for this one. I'm wondering, in your experience, do you have any insights to how a comparatively low-profile agency is able to grow trust? Sometimes it's easy for the fire service, for example, because everybody is aware of them. What about a more low-profile agency?
I think that a lot of what we've spoken about and what James has referred to, I think kind of still holds true whether you have particularly high or low awareness. So certainly some of the institutions that are in our top 10 don't have particularly high awareness. So, for example, Callaghan Innovation or the Health Promotion Agency, they're not particularly well known, but the people that do know of them do think highly of them and have high regard. And I think, it was interesting, I've done some previous work around some of the drivers of trust, and a lot of that kind of mirrors what James had referred to. So, we looked at kind of three kind of sort of key drivers around credibility, reliability, and intimacy and stuff. So, that organizations, know what they're doing, that not only do you do it well once, but you've got a kind of trusted record, you repeatedly perform, but also that intimacy, again, relating to actually the feelings that you have, and throwing into that, I guess, kind of sort of motivation. So I think kind of James referred to the kind of selflessness. And those kind of sort of the work that we've done for Inland Revenue here in New Zealand, that, the systems that they put in place to really make it easy for people to get to kind of sort of process sort of financial returns, and that actually even if you just get an email saying, well, you've got a $1.26 refund, you kind of think, oh, well, where's that come from? But actually it just helps kind of show, yeah, they're on my side, that they are just kind of, keeping on top of things.
Thanks, Edward. I'll throw back to you for this question, but then I'll throw to James afterwards to get his view. We've had a question about media. I know in your presentation you spoke about people's perception of how much they will trust the media now compared to previously. And the question is around how important sort of traditional media is, and particular shock jocks. I don't know if you have them in New Zealand, I assume you do, in undermining trust compared with something like social media.
That's a really good question. Certainly in terms of shaping reputation, that's something that we do ask on the index as well, in terms of, where do your opinions come from? What's most important? And with most agencies, certainly the media is the most important influencer. For some agencies, it's about experience. So, for example, I mentioned Inland Revenue, and that's actually for them, experience is by far the most important influencer. And also we found that traditional media are actually very important within that, then in terms of within the media space, kind of much more so than social media or perhaps what is shared. The extent to which kind of sort of shock jocks and everything kind of undermine that, well, I mean, that would be interesting. It's not something that we've looked at, but certainly I think we need to think about it, our discourse in terms of actually how much we just kind of generalize, and rather than see kind of some of the nuance as such.
So if I could just weigh in, I would just look at this again from a perspective of, one has to analyze the plethora of different channels that the community is influenced by, modern social media being one, another one being shock jocks, and as Edward was mentioning, just traditional channels. A really good case study that I accidentally found by accident, because I happened to be, in a hospital in an emergency ward, nothing serious, waiting for some scans, watching daytime TV, and the ACCC, our competition and consumer regulator here, was running a program through daytime television to be aware of scams, and I thought it was absolutely brilliant, because they were targeting folks sitting at home watching daytime TV who are more susceptible for scams because they're at home. And that's what I thought was absolutely brilliant, and an example of being very strategic and deliberate about using different channels for different messages for different purposes. In many respects, it's not dissimilar to that strategic regulatory craft approach that Malcolm Sparrow applies. We have to be as strategic in our media and our engagement communications as we are in the deployment of our regulatory and other tools.
Thanks, James. I think we've got time for a couple more questions, so I'll try and pick a couple that are joined up. There's a few questions here about building trust with regulated entities, and I know you touched on this before, James. When you're thinking about how you build trust with regulated entities, how do you do that when you may have to make uncomfortable regulatory decisions about them and their reputation? And also, how do you balance that with the need to gain trust from consumers at the same time?
Yeah, so that is the tightrope that we walk, and that's why I think the best word is engagement. We have to have a constructive engagement with the regulated community, and often you hear other adjectives and terms being applied. I still think the best way of applying it and having an anchor is constructive engagement. We need to be talking to each other, and they need to understand where we're coming from. That societal purpose that Edward has been talking about, and I've been proposing for quite some time, is so important. And equally, we have to understand the business drivers and the other drivers of the regulated population in our world. What I genuinely do think is fundamentally missing is a better understanding, or a true understanding, of the purpose of where we're coming from. Because I think sometimes when it comes to regulators, regulatory agencies, we're just seen as another police force, but we're not a traditional police force. As I said, as a regulatory agency, I believe that we're in the business of modifying behaviours in line with societal and legal norms. We're in the modification of behaviours business. And yes, we will use enforcement. Yes, we will use communications. Yes, we will use surveillance. Yes, we will use policy announcements and the like. But that's why I think we actually have to have a reset almost, and a fundamental reset of the understandings of where we're coming from. Equally, when it comes to the community, actually, I'm the first one to admit, we all need to do a better job of getting out and being better understood or perceived, as Edward was saying, by the community more broadly. As Edward was saying, we have to get the message out that we have their back, that we are on the side of the community, that we will try and help and protect them. And I thought it was very interesting, wasn't it, that Edward mentioned when he was observing the top three in New Zealand, they're in the protection business, the Defence Forces, the Customs Services, the Fire and Emergency Services, they're in the protection business. I think ASIC is in the protection business as well. And I'm actually quite motivated, and I've learned a lot from Edward today about trying to get that message out to the broader community that we're in the protection business as well.
Thanks, James. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop us there because we're out of time, which is a real shame because there were quite a few questions left. But I do want to thank you both for your time today.